Ben Norton, great to see you.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, of course. So you've been talking about, first of all, everybody go and watch his videos.
Geopolitical Economy Report. That's what it's called.
Amazing, fantastic information. You break it down so effectively. But one of the things that you've been arguing is that basically the U.S. Trump's insane trade war situation has already failed. So maybe you could start by making the case for why you think he has already manifested complete failure in whatever his ultimate aims were here.
Great. Well, we'll start by laying out what these supposed goals of these tariffs are. This was articulated by Trump's top economic advisor, Stephen Myron, and he gave this very strange speech. The transcript of it was published by the White House, and he gave it at this neoconservative think tank in Washington, the Hudson Institute, which is funded by Harlan Crow and all these conservative billionaires. And in the speech, he said that the Trump administration is using tariffs for 5 main reasons. To, 1, force other countries to pay the United States. He said that other countries should write checks to the U.S. Treasury for the privilege of using the U.S. dollar and having the U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. government debt, as the backbone of the global financial system. He said that another goal with the tariffs was to try to reindustrialize the U.S. He said another goal was to force other countries to buy more products from the U.S., and in particular, he named U.S. military contractors, the military-industrial complex, so buy U.S. weapons. And then he said another goal was to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with other countries, and he said that another goal was to attract investment from other countries. If you go through line by line in all those policies, they've all failed. And in particular, the idea that the U.S. will reindustrialize based simply on tariffs is laughable. I mean, you would have to completely ignore the entire history of industrialization to think that all you need is tariffs and magically a country will industrialize. Now, what's quite interesting about this is if you go back in U.S. history, the father of what's known as industrial policy, which, as the name suggests, it's the policies that a government uses to encourage industrial production, that actually goes back to Alexander Hamilton. You know, people know about him through the famous musical, but he was the first Treasury Secretary in the U.S., and in the late 18th century, he published a famous report on manufacturers in which he outlined policies that the U.S. government should take in order to foster manufacturing production. And the U.S. was trying to compete at that time with the British and the French. And he said that the government should invest in infrastructure through state banking to strategic industries, should invest in education. So all of the kinds of state-led policies that Donald Trump opposes, because Trump is actually implementing austerity. He's talking about cutting government support for all of these programs. He's talking about abolishing the Department of Education. So, I mean, in all of these ways, Trump is ignoring what actual industrial policy would be needed in order to reindustrialize. Furthermore, the idea that other countries, other companies from around the world will invest in the U.S. is absurd because there's so much uncertainty. Even in the U.S., companies are not investing because they don't know if the tariffs will change next week, if they'll change tomorrow, if they'll still be here in a year. And of course, if Trump does leave power in a few years and there's another election, which the fact that it's even up in the air is pretty crazy. But I mean, if there is a Democrat that comes in and lifts all these tariffs, why would companies invest billions and billions of dollars making a factory in the U.S. if the tariffs may be lifted in a few years? There's so much uncertainty that there's not investment happening. And instead, the exact opposite is actually happening. There's a lot of capital flight, which is why the U.S. dollar has actually been falling. Normally, in times of economic crisis, the dollar rises because if there's crisis in multiple countries in the global economy, investors will pile into U.S. assets, which they see as more secure assets. The dollar has actually been falling because a lot of foreign investors have been selling their U.S. assets. And then finally, this whole issue with the U.S. trade deficit. I mean, the U.S. designed the financial system in a particular way at the end of World War II that gave the U.S. what's known as the exorbitant privilege of printing the global reserve currency. That term was actually invented by France's finance minister. France was complaining in the 1960s that the U.S. could simply print more and more of its currency, and the U.S. can never really run a balance of payments crisis because the value of the dollar is not going to fall significantly because people around the world need dollars. So the U.S. has had these privileges from the dollar being the global reserve currency, but Trump is angry with this system because it also has led to the deindustrialization of the U.S., and his economic advisor, Stephen Myron, has pointed out that the dollar is chronically overvalued because there's so much demand for it around the world, and that makes it very hard to compete internationally because if your currency is very overvalued and other people have their own local currency, it means that when they buy U.S. products, those products are very expensive. So Trump says he wants to reindustrialize the U.S., but he also says he wants to maintain the U.S. dollar, and he says he wants to end U.S. trade deficits. But the only way that this system works is if the U.S. runs trade deficits, because Trump wants other countries to use dollars in international trade and to hold dollar assets in their foreign exchange reserves. But in order to do all of that, other countries have to get the dollars. Where do those dollars come from? Well, the U.S. runs trade deficits, and other countries get those dollars. That's their savings. So if Trump wants to end U.S. trade deficits, then he would have to end this dollar system, which he also says he wants to preserve. And Trump has threatened 100% tariffs on countries that try to de-dollarize. So if you look at every stated goal of the Trump administration's tariffs, they have failed already. And then this brings into the issue of China, which we can talk about Trump issued exemptions for Chinese electronics. So if he says he wants to reindustrialize, and he says he wants to use tariffs to build local industry to create things like computers and cell phones and semiconductors, then why is he issuing exemptions for Chinese cell phones, computers, and semiconductors? Because he knows that actually the U.S. is not going to reindustrialize. And I think ultimately the main goal that Trump has with these tariffs, it's not all of these stated policies that they're trying to use to justify them. In reality, it's pretty simple. Trump wants to use tariffs to replace income tax as government revenue because he wants to slash taxes on the rich and corporations. He said that very clearly. He wants to go back to the 19th century when almost all U.S. government revenue came from tariffs, which are the most regressive form of taxation because tariffs are a tax on consumption. Trump falsely claims that foreign countries pay for tariffs. It's not true. It's U.S. importers that pay for tariffs, which means that importers in the U.S., where they have to pay more for these imported goods, and in order to maintain their profit margins, some of that cost has to go down to the consumers, which means that Americans are going to pay more for all of these imported consumer goods. So in other words, Trump is cutting taxes on the rich and corporations and increasing taxes on everyone else in the form of consumption in the form of tariffs.
I think the other aspect of it, Ben, too, is I think that's definitely part of it. That's why he talks about William McKinley all the time and why it's important for people to understand when these, first of all, the number one point is reindustrialization is not going to happen. But second of all, even if, Trump strong arms a few companies to bring jobs back or whatever, they don't have in mind the 1950s when you had high rates of unionization, when you had an expanding social safety net, when you had some level of
91% top marginal tax rate.
91%. That's not what they want. They want to go back before progressive era reforms when you didn't have pesky things like child labor laws.
Environmental laws.
Yeah, when, you're talking like Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and they want the U.S. worker to join the global race to the bottom. And to the extent that, workers would be involved in this at all, you also have them talking about, it'll be robots that do it. And maybe you can fix the air conditioning for the robots. But all of it is beside the point anyway, because none of this is going to work. But, I wanted to get you to weigh in on, I think the other aspect of this is not just the regressive taxes and the, helping the oligarchs get their goodies. I think the other piece is this is power consolidation. Now every country in the world is calling Trump. All these companies are paying their $1 million to go to Mar-a-Lago and get their exemption and get their carve out. He has claimed this sole vast power to turn, our economy upside down and the economy of countries around the world upside down. And they all have to petition the king if they want to be able to survive. So to me, that's actually at the core of what he's really up to here, which doesn't, I mean, it obviously has massive impacts on the economy, but isn't actually an economic project. It's an authoritarian project.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, we saw this in this crazy speech that Trump delivered at this Republican gala dinner where he boasted that countries are coming and kissing his ass. That's what he said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's
right.
amazing. And other countries are going to see this video. I mean, but what Trump is really trying to do is I really think in many ways, the U.S. is an empire. We've known this for decades. Every U.S. president is the leader of the empire. But Trump wants to go back to an old kind of 19th century imperialism, where he says we're going to colonize Greenland. We're going to colonize the Panama Canal. We're going to colonize Gaza to build luxury real estate. He's threatening to colonize Canada. And unfortunately, I don't think that's a joke. I think he's pretty serious about that.
Yeah.
So Trump talks a lot about McKinley's tariffs, but it's not just tariffs. If you look at the White House fact sheet that was published about McKinley with the reasons the Trump administration listed about why they admire McKinley, they also mentioned that McKinley expanded the territory of the United States. He was a colonialist. And Trump has a very similar worldview. In fact, in a speech that Trump delivered in Las Vegas just a few days after his inauguration, he promised his supporters that he was going to greatly expand the territory of the U.S. And he wants to colonize multiple areas of the world. So Trump really sees the world in this kind of 19th century way. And you mentioned, bringing back child labor. We see this happening, for instance, in Florida. They've been pushing through these new laws to try to make it easier to employ teenagers at night before school. I mean, that really is the goal. And it's really funny because, in a very sick way, because Trump claims he was going to bring down inflation, right? I mean, that's really one of the main reasons that Trump won. Polls show that a majority of voters said that the economy was the most important issue, and inflation was blamed on the incumbent. This happened in countries all around the world. There were inflation shocks in many countries due to the supply chain disruptions during the pandemic, and incumbent parties lost. Trump said he's going to bring down inflation. Well, all of the policies that he's carrying out are inflationary in terms of tariffs, inflationary, deporting immigrants, inflationary. And now, because there's a shortage of workers because of deporting immigrants, what are they going to do? They're going to exploit teenagers, bring back child labor. So I think you're absolutely right that one of the goals is simply an attack on all of the progressive elements of the New Deal and an attack on all of the progressive elements of the state. That's why they plan on abolishing the Department of Education. It's why DOGE is not touching, Elon Musk's vanity project. They're not touching the Pentagon. Trump has pledged he's going to expand military spending to $1 trillion while they're cutting any aspect of the state that could actually help people. They're planning on cutting Medicaid. They want to go after Social Security. So the 19th century is really the vision they have. It's really terrifying.
Yeah.
So on April 2nd, we had Trump called them reciprocal tariffs. They weren't reciprocal tariffs. They were about 4 times more because they used the trade deficit and the way they calculated it. Then he backs off, does 10% for almost everybody, and 100% or more. He kept raising it for China. And he says, I'm doing this because they retaliated. Then he exempts electronics and then says, no, I know that we released a statement on that, but actually there's no exemptions. And he's at the point where he's basically begging for a phone call from President Xi. And just walk everybody through China's reaction to the tariffs every step of the way, because I think that's actually a really important part of the story so people know who really holds the cards here.
Yeah, well, you made a very important point. These tariffs are not reciprocal by definition. They're unilateral and aggressive. The Trump's team used a formula, and it's widely suspected that they used artificial intelligence, ChatGPT or something, which is very possible, because it's not based on other countries' tariff rates. It's based on the trade deficit that the U.S. has with each country, which is why there are these uninhabited islands with penguins that are being tariffed. And it's why these small, just tiny little nations, like, for instance, the African nation of Lesotho, which the U.S. basically sells nothing to them, and they export a little to the U.S., so the U.S. is putting 50% tariffs on them, which is crazy. It's not because Lesotho, this tiny little African nation, has 50% tariffs on the U.S.
They were screwing us over, Ben. We got to show Lesotho who's boss.
Yeah, exactly. Or like the Falkland Islands off of Argentina. Yeah, it's great. And it's also very funny because you have some of these right-wing leaders in Latin America, like Javier Milei in Argentina or Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who have been doing everything they can to bow down to Trump, and yet he still hits them with these tariffs. But anyway, getting back to this issue of the exceptions. So then, in response to that, China actually implemented reciprocal tariffs. They said, okay, Trump announced a certain level, it was 43% plus the original 20%. China said, okay, they already had the 20% that they applied, so we'll apply 43%, which is actual reciprocal tariffs. And then Trump said China was attacking the US, even though China was responding to his attack. So he kept raising it. And basically every few days he raises it more and more, which is mostly symbolic because after you reach a certain point, Chinese products are going to become much more expensive and there's not going to be much trade. So he kept raising it and raising it. It was 145%. And then Trump just added another 100%. And now he says it's 245%. China, their Department of Commerce released a statement saying they have 100-something% tariffs on the US and they're not going to raise it anymore because it won't actually have an impact. At that point, it's just, a little kid saying, well, I'm the best. No, I'm the best. I mean, that's how Trump is acting. And in terms of the exceptions, so on the 11th, 9 days after so-called Liberation Day, the White House publishes this executive order announcing exceptions. Trump said they were not exceptions, but they are exceptions. Now, they're not zero tariffs. Instead of having 145% or 245% tariffs on Chinese electronics, they're 20%. So that means that the cost of iPhones and computers and many other products made in China, those costs are going to increase slightly in the US. Maybe not by 20% because some of that will be paid by the importers, but there's going to be an increase in the cost of these electronics goods. And I think there are a few reasons for that. First of all, we know that Tim Cook has been, he's the CEO of Apple. Mm-hmm. He's been constantly calling Trump and begging Trump to reduce these tariffs because there's no alternative to producing these products in China. Apple has tried to diversify its supply chain. They're trying to make them in India, but for a variety of reasons, they can't. And as even Tim Cook has pointed out, it's not because workers in China are like paid nothing. There's a stereotype. It's not true. In fact, the average income of Chinese workers has increased by 10 times in the past 30 years. And in fact, Chinese manufacturing wages are much higher than the other countries around China, especially in Southeast Asia. In fact, a lot of companies investing in new factories are investing in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, because wages there are much lower than in China. The reason that manufacturing is so effective in China is, one, a lot of this process is already automated. Two, they have a lot of very skilled workers, whereas in the US, because the US deindustrialized, there's a major shortage of skilled workers, which is why Tim Cook did an interview with Forbes, and he explained that in China, you could fill multiple football stadiums with workers who know how to use these very advanced tools that they need to make iPhones. Whereas he said in the US, you couldn't fill a room with these people. Trump thinks that overnight, you just magically put tariffs on and all of the investments will come back to the US. They'll make all these factories. How are they going to who are the construction workers going to be? Because he's going to be deporting so many immigrants, which are largely, the US construction industry relies a lot on immigrant workers. So, I mean, that's going to cost much more. Then Trump's cutting education. Who's going to educate all the workers and train them with these skills they need to use these advanced tools? We're not just talking about, little screwdrivers, as Howard Lutnick claimed in this very ridiculous comment. We're talking about a process that involves a lot of advanced machinery and advanced technology. By the way, where is that machinery going to come from? You can't just magically make an iPhone. In addition to making the factories, you have to import all of the capital goods, all of the intermediate goods, all of the parts, all of the machines needed to make these phones. These are complex supply chains. That's all in China. And now some of it's in Vietnam, some of it's in India. But these are very complex global supply chains. Where is the US going to get the rare earth elements that are needed for these electronics? Because China is responsible for over 90% of global processing of rare earths. Trump says he wants to create a new supply chain. Well, in response to Trump's tariffs, China responded by restricting the export of rare earth elements to the US. So at every single level, it's clear Trump did not think about any of this. All he said is we're just going to put tariffs on and everything will magically fall in place. All that's going to happen is prices will increase. CNBC they did a survey of many different US companies, and the majority of US companies said that they're not going to open new factories. They're not planning on investing in the US. They're planning on increasing prices. And the majority of respondents in this poll said that they expect a recession and they expect higher prices in the US. So what we're talking about is stagflation, like in the 1970s, both recession or economic stagnation and inflation at the same time.
Yeah, and that's what Treasury Secretary Jay Powell yesterday basically said. He didn't
and
use
Trump
the
is
word
now attacking him today. He's attacking him today. Do you see that?
But that's effectively what he laid out. This is tricky to, really put your finger on, but I think another advantage that China has is like Americans don't want this trade war. People, like you said, they thought they were getting like, oh, he's a businessman and he's going to bring prices down. And so let's vote for Trump. And yeah, he said he was going to put tariffs on. So we can't say he didn't campaign on this at all. But he certainly did not lay out this particular program. And I think most people were more focused on the rhetoric he was also engaged in about how he was going to bring prices down. So you have an American society, it's not even divided. Like it's pretty firmly in the camp of what are you doing? This is insane. You see his approval rating fall. You see his economic approval rating fall off a cliff, et cetera. What do you think the energy is like in China? Because I would think there would be a sort of almost like a rally around the flag effect. Like we're under attack from this country that's being belligerent and insane. And so I would also expect that there would be more sort of like willingness, more national camaraderie and unity around the project of the Chinese government in trying to fight back against this trade war.
Hey guys, this is only a small piece of a very long interview with Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report. He's an expert on everything that's going on with the tariffs and the trade war and China. You're definitely going to want to see the whole interview. Sign up below on Substack in order to do that.